First known as the PS-84, the aircraft was modified for cold weather use. Despite the desire for minimal adjustments, over 1,293 engineering changes were ordered on the original Douglas blueprints. Renamed the Li-2 in recognition of Lisunov's achievement, the aircraft became Russia's primary troop airlifter. These tough and reliable transports carried troops and cargo to famous battles in Stalingrad, Kursk, and Kharkov. Another aircraft also served well in a secondary role. The PE-8 was a pure Russian design and the only Soviet heavy bomber of the war. The project was created in 1934 in answer to a requirement for precision bombing from high altitude with a range of 4,500 kilometers. Andrei Tupolev designed the original aircraft, but following his arrest during Stalin's purges, the project was taken over by Vladimir Petlyakov. The PE-8 used unreliable diesel engines and proved unsuccessful as a bomber. A re-engined version was used to ferry Molotov to meetings in Dundee and to Washington, D.C. to discuss Lend-Lease policy. The big Petlyakov didn't work well as a bomber, but it proved useful as a diplomatic courier aircraft. Meanwhile, a rising star was making his mark in the Soviet aviation industry. Born in Vladivostok as the son of a fisherman, Sergei Ilyushin rose to prominence as the designer of the IL-2 Stromovik tank buster. After World War II, Ilyushin moved into the transport business. His first effort was the IL-12, designed in 1944 as a successor to the Lisunov Li-2. An air assault version was built, but the aircraft's fuel consumption was high. It also suffered from handling problems. Better performance was reached with the IL-14, which was the first Soviet aircraft widely exported to more than 30 countries. Ilyushin would go on to establish a solid reputation as a builder of giant transport aircraft. In the early 1950s, major steps had been taken in the world of air transport. In 1954, the Americans developed one of the most legendary airlifters ever built, the Lockheed CA-30. Its rugged design and high performance added a new dimension to airborne military operations. Not to be outdone, Russia's answer was the AN-12, one of the first in a long line of heavy-lift aircraft built by the Antonov Design Bureau. Early tests of the new aircraft were promising. The aircraft first flew in prototype form in 1958. It was based on the earlier AN-10 airframe and was powered by 4 Kuznetsov NK-4 engines. The transport featured a full-section rear door, but the designers were forced to abandon pressurization of the cargo hold. The AN-12 was fitted with a titanium floor, stressed to handle high weight loading. Cargo was positioned with the aid of an electric crane, capable of traveling the length of the hold. The new aircraft was codenamed the Cub in the West. The cockpit area was pressurized, as well as a 14-seat compartment added behind the flight deck for crews of armored fighting vehicles. In the 1950s and 60s, military theorists felt certain that any war in Europe would involve large-scale air assault operations. Western leaders relied on the member armies of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization called NATO. In case of a massive invasion from the east, these forces would provide a tripwire defense, while US nuclear weapons did their work. The Soviet Union and its Warsaw Pact allies had a different plan, however. This called for an all-out offensive, spearheaded in part by fleets of AN-12s, delivering overwhelming air-mobile shock forces. The Red Army pioneered the use of innovative applications like the retro rocket to slow the fall of heavy equipment. The Soviet Air Force worked steadily throughout the Cold War to improve the quantity and quality of its transport aircraft and air assault capability. The continuing improvement took NATO by surprise.
Todos será la victoria.
The emergence of Fidel Castro marked the beginning of the darkest time of the Cold War. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev had a new friend in Cuba, a strategically placed ideological counterpart on the other side of the world, but only 135 kilometers off the coast of America. The Soviets had gained preeminence in space and military technology. Khrushchev now had a new site to launch his missiles from. He seized the opportunity, realizing the psychological and strategic importance. Soviet missiles shipped to Cuba could strike US cities within minutes. It was a major crisis for a new presidential administration. President John F. Kennedy remained firm, staring eyeball to eyeball in a superpower showdown. Khrushchev flinched, or perhaps saved the world from nuclear Armageddon in a foreign policy gamble that eventually cost him his leadership. Years later, an article titled "Bears Can't Fly" appeared in the Western press. It stated that Kremlin leaders failed to intervene in the 1973 Middle East War on the side of their Arab allies because Russia lacked strategic air mobility. The arrival of a giant new transport from the Antonov Bureau, the AN-22, was intended to address these shortfalls and restore Russian prestige. It was the largest aircraft in existence when introduced in 1965. The Soviets nicknamed the AN-22 the Antheus, after the giant son of Poseidon and Gaia in Greek mythology. There were high hopes for the aircraft's development as a military transport and commercial airliner, capable of moving over 700 passengers. Unfortunately, the AN-22 didn't live up to its expectations. The Antheus was designed to carry the full range of Soviet tanks and armored vehicles, including surface-to-air missile launchers. Like the AN-12 Cub, pressurization in the AN-22 was restricted to the flight deck and forward fuselage, which could accommodate only 29 passengers. But despite its drawbacks, the Antheus had an enormous load capability. The cargo hold featured a floor of reinforced titanium fitted with a non-slip finish and cargo locks. It had a combination door and ramp which allowed heavy cargo like main battle tanks to be brought inside and lifted by overhead cranes. The wingspan of the massive turboprop was 70 meters. In a heroic record attempt, the Antheus lifted 100,000 kilos to a height of 8,300 meters. In spite of its success as a record setter, the AN-22 was disappointing in service. The Antonov Design Bureau would have to wait before it gained undisputed preeminence as a designer of giant transports. Another Antonov creation, the AN-30, is one of the few special purpose-designed aerial survey aircraft. It features an extended glazed nose and a raised flight deck to give the navigator a wide field of view. It has optical cameras and a darkroom, as well as sensors for all types of mapping. In the United States, the concept of air mobility had taken on a new importance. President Lyndon Johnson visited Edwards Air Force Base to see the latest aircraft. One was the giant Lockheed C-141 Starlifter. Used extensively in Vietnam, it was America's first all-jet long-range transport. C-141s provided crucial airlift capability, dropping paratroopers, carrying air mobile units and evacuating seriously wounded servicemen to the Philippines, Japan, and Hawaii. Through long, reliable service, the Starlifter proved to be the workhorse of the U.S. Air Mobility Command. The Russian answer to the C-141 was developed by the Ilyushin Design Bureau. The new IL-76 was powered by 4 turbofan engines, and in many ways it resembled the Lockheed Starlifter, though it was slightly larger. It was 51 meters long, with a wingspan of 55. The prototype first flew in March 1971 and was quickly codenamed Candid by NATO. Russian airlift capability had been eclipsed by the West since the pioneering experiments of the 1930s. The Soviets answered the challenge with a series of airborne exercises aimed at giving them the edge in the race to intervene in times of crisis. IL-76s were used extensively in these operations, though the Candid is smaller than most of its Western counterparts. Designed to operate in the harsh Russian climate, the Ilyushin flies in all weather conditions. Its airborne cargo delivery systems were adapted from the Soviet space program. The aircraft drops its load from a great height, with only a single parachute to slow it. It descends quickly until sensors ignite retro rockets just before touchdown. In 1979, the Soviet Union airlifted 5,000 airborne troops into Kabul, the Afghan capital. These troops assisted the democratically elected Afghan government fighting against the rebels. The IL-76 is still in service at the Zhukovsky Flight Test Center outside Moscow. The aircraft was intended to replace the multi-role turbo-powered AN-12 Cub. Designers were tasked with producing an aircraft that could carry 41,000 kilos of freight, a distance of 4,650 kilometers, in less than 6 hours. These feats were to be accomplished under the worst conditions of the Siberian winter. The IL-76 is a versatile aircraft. This version is able to drop large quantities of fire retardant. In July 1976, the Candid established 25 official payload to altitude at speed records. There is also an airborne early warning and control version similar to the US AWACS. It's known to NATO by its code name, Mainstay. It's traditional for Russia to always use its aircraft as flexibly as possible. This Candid is performing very low-level cargo drop test runs. The IL-76 is also used for in-flight refueling. This major version took 10 years to develop from the mid-1970s to the mid-1980s. The tanker version is known to NATO as the Midas. These thirsty MiG-23 fighters are maneuvering to refuel from the Midas's large replenishment tanks. Earlier Soviet aircraft used a wingtip-to-wingtip system, but the system used by the IL-76 extends from the fuselage and wings of the tanker aircraft. The fuel lines connect to refueling probes located near the pilot's canopy on the MiG-23. This makes it possible to refuel more than one aircraft at a time. This flexible system also allows the Midas to greatly extend the range of strategic bombers, including the Tupolev Tu-95 turboprop Bear. It's also capable of refueling the supersonic swing-wing Tupolev Tu-22M backfire and Tu-160 Blackjack bombers.